At the Create Daily, we know it isn't easy being a storyteller, especially if you've been historically excluded. We also know how much can come between us and getting the work done. That's where the lab comes in. Introducing the Create Daily Lab, our library of courses, workshops, and tools to help you establish a healthy creative practice while prioritizing the things that you can control. The lab is here to help you with your craft, your practice, and your know-how, all in one place. Keep up with the latest happenings at the lab at thecreatedaily.com. That's thecreatedaily.com. It's time to get to work. When you see the process, you like, oh, I gotta really want to write because I gotta write and then write some more and then write some more. So that I think is really, really tremendous. And also, you know, the writing process will reveal certain things of like your story's not working. We did it.
Woo, woo.
We're here. We are here with a whole podcast. A whole podcast. Not half a podcast. A whole podcast.
That's right. 100.
Welcome to the Creative Cut Up Podcast, a lively and honest space for storytellers that sits at the intersection of craft, business, and independence. I'm Felicia Pride, a writer, director, producer, head honey and honey child, and head storyteller of the Create Daily, a platform I founded in 2012 to help storytellers, especially those of us who are historically excluded, thrive creatively and professionally. And I'm here with my co-host because we got some cutting up to do.
We sure do. I'm Dria Rowland, the creative executive at Honey Child and a writer and producer.
Yes, she is.
And I'm Georgette Pierre, a voice actor and producer. You can hear it, right?
Oh, we hear that voice,
right.
honey.
Oh,
we
yeah.
hear the voice.
Oh, yeah.
So join us weekly where we talk shop and smack and share the good, the bad, and the ugly. And from 3 different perspectives, which I love, providing tangible tips to support your creative practice, your career, and your artist self. Because we all know that being an artist is hard as hell.
Oof. Say that.
But the Creative Cut Up is here to help. Shall we begin, ladies?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. We back. Another edition of the Creative Cut Up Podcast.
Tell your mama.
Okay.
Tell your mama.
And your
tell
friends.
your friends. Tell everybody. Tell everybody. Sharing is caring. Thank y'all so much for all the love that y'all are showing us. But make sure you share it with a friend who needs to hear this information. Share it with a friend of me. You know what I mean? Share it with everybody. Because in the midst of doing this podcast, we all have very busy lives. We have full-time jobs.
Mm-hmm.
We also are building an independent production company called Honey Child. We're building the Create Daily to be as impactful as possible. And we're working on creative projects. And today we kind of want to get into a little bit of the writing process. And, you know, I have to admit, over the past couple of months, I've been the busiest I've ever been in my life. And it has really tested me. And mainly because it's been writing under intense deadlines. And I realize I don't like that shit. But that's part of the career. But the only way I feel like I've been able to get through this time is because I have a writing process. And so today I really want us to dive into the writing process from our 3 different perspectives. And that I think it is writers saving grace when we have a process. So I want to talk about that today.
Let's get into it.
Yes.
Let's get into it. Because I got to tell you, my first feature, which became really loved, child, I had no process. Okay. I did not know how to manage rewriting. I did not know how long it takes me to do things. I did not have that. Right. Fast forward to now, and I have a very specific writing process that may, be tweaked from project to project, but I kind of know what it is. So I want to kind of just dive into what my process looks like. And I'll focus on projects that are in development, not staffing jobs, right? Not the process of writing on, because we talked a little bit about that process in the writer's room episode. Check that out. Episode 4, cutting up about the writer's room. So I'll focus on projects that, TV and film projects that I write that are our development. So where I usually start is sometimes I need to start with some research, right? Mm-hmm. And often Dria and or Georgette will help pull some research on a specific topic. You know, one project I wrote was about track and field. So just pulling research about track and field, about collegiate track and field and all of that, just so I can start to kind of be immersed in that world a little bit by reading articles. And then I also do like a social media thing where I start to follow like collegiate track and field athletes, and I start to follow the NCAA, and I start to follow, all those, just so I kind of also have like a current lens on what's happening. And those clips were really, really helpful, especially when I was writing this particular feature. It wasn't track and field, but it was like the women's NCAA basketball championships, and just the personalities of the players. What's homegirl's name from Baltimore? Yes. I was able to kind of fuse that energy. So it was really, really helpful. So I started in a research phase, but you cannot stay in research. Folks like to stay in research, right? Because it's not writing, right? So folks like to be in the research phase, but you got to get out of the research phase. Often too, while I'm in the research phase, I may have to come up with a calendar for myself. Like, this is how I'm going to be able to get this done. Because for instance, for features, you get 3 months to write a feature. If you sell a feature film, the typical contractual time that you have to write it is 3 months. And I like to say that you try to research during contract negotiations, okay? Because that might take 6 months. Don't start writing though, because the contract negotiations may fall apart. But at least you can start the research process, right? Because you want all your 3 months to be writing, right? So the first month I always like to say is outlining. Second month is drafting. Third month is rewriting. That's kind of how I think about it in my head. So I may have to develop some sort of calendar for myself in order to meet this deadline. And then I start by doing a preliminary outline, usually a beat sheet, where I'm just beating out the major plot points. And sometimes I take that straight from my pitch. And what's interesting though is like going from pitch to outline can be very different. In your pitch, you selling the story, you like, I got this. Then when you start getting the outline, you're like, I don't have a whole act 2. It felt like an act 2 in the pitch, but it's not a real act 2. That's when you start to see the challenges, the problems, the gaps, the holes is in the beat sheet process, right? Also during that process, I may be fleshing out the characters a little bit more. And really what I'm most concerned about is their wounds, what their major goal is. And what's stopping that goal. Those are the 3 major things that I care about for the characters. Where they're from is good. Some like that type of biographical character work. I also am concerned about voice. What do these characters sound like? Because when I get into dialogue, I really need to understand what these characters sound like. So those are like the 4 major things I'm most concerned about, because the wound is like what's pressing up against them. Their goal is their drive. The obstacles is plot, right? And then their voice is dialogue. So those are the things that I'm really trying to get into. And then from the beat sheet, I'll go into an actual outline where I am getting into some scene work. What is this scene? Trying to understand what this scene actually is, I like to spend a lot of time in outlining, because again, that's where you can figure out your problems. So that when you get to draft, you're just writing, hopefully. That's not always the case, because sometimes you need to get to draft quicker but you find yourself wishing you had done more of the upfront work in outlining, because you're like, I don't know what this fucking scene's about. Had I figured this scene out during the outline stage, I could just write it, but now I have to figure it out. So I try to do as much of the heavy lifting and outlining. And I also try to get feedback at the outline stage, whether that is from my story editor or that is from my writers group. I need the preliminary feedback there. That's a good place that I like to get feedback. Make sure that this is making sense. Are there major things that I'm missing? Are these character actions making sense? Like big overall feedback, forest feedback, not trees feedback, forest feedback. And then I go straight into draft. I don't revise outlines typically. I just know what the feedback is and I take that into the draft. And usually I just save the outline as a new document that'll be my script. So I work directly from the outline and flesh out those scenes that way. And I try to write as fast as possible. Sometimes that's not always the case because again, with these intense deadlines, it has been really, really hard. But usually if I'm in a group, I want to throw up that draft because I need to get feedback as quickly as possible. Sometimes also, depending how tight the schedule is, I may be getting feedback simultaneously while I'm writing. So I may have an act 1 written and I send it to my story editor or I send it to my writers group folks to get feedback on that first act, and I'm continuing to write. Sometimes if I get the feedback, sometimes I'm like, I just have to keep going and I'll go back and rewrite act 1. I know what needs to change in act 1, but I got to keep going. Because sometimes you just need to finish that draft and then you rewrite. And then after I finish the draft, I get feedback on the whole draft, or I may have gotten feedback in pieces, but I still have gotten feedback on the whole draft, and I start my rewriting process. And that rewriting process could be 1 draft, 2 drafts, 3, 10, 15. You just don't know how much it's going to be. But because I like to have my work what I call as studio ready as possible, so that when it goes to the producers I'm working with, they have something very strong to respond to and have as minimal notes as possible so that it is as studio ready as possible. I have found that I'm not that great developing with producers. I need to have my own process and then give them something strong to respond to. They can have their notes and I can turn that around very quickly. So I'm going through my own very thorough process before it even gets to them. So often before it gets to the producers, I have written several drafts of this TV pilot or this film. And so then that's the rewriting stage, which can take how long it takes. And it starts out broad. We get the forest rewriting. And then I'll usually get page notes from my story editor, which every page she'll be like, this scene, I don't feel the tension in this scene, is an example of a page note. I feel like we're losing the momentum in this section. That'll be an example of a page note. So I go through and you open up the PDF, and it could be 100 comments and this is after you've done several rewrites. This is your last hoorah. And you're like, fuck, I have 100 comments on your stage. Just work through your 100 comments. And then do this process. I'm continuously reading it, right? I'm reading it aloud to see how it's reading, how it's feeling as part of my own editing process, as part of my own rewriting process. But then once I go through the page notes, usually that's when then I'll send it off to the producers. And then the producers may have feedback. And again, I try to get it as studio ready so their feedback's very light and I can turn that around, and then it goes on to the studio. The studio will have whatever notes that they have, but that's sort of the writing process. And I think it's very important for writers to have a process and to protect that process at all costs, because it'll be you who they will look to if the draft is not where it needs to be. They will look at you. So protecting that, having a process and protecting that process.
And then I'm curious, physically, what does that process look like, right? Like some people say our brand is called the Create Daily. Some people say you got to sit down and write every day. Some people need to go to a coffee shop. Some people, have what is your place, your process, your ritual, for writing?
I think that I had to start out, for the most part, I kind of almost write every day because I have a lot of projects that have to be written. I want to get to a point where I'm not writing every day. So that we're working on that. I can write anywhere because you have to be able to write anywhere. I prefer to write in my office with music playing and a candle lit. However, as I tell people, we like to write by candlelight for 2 years. Our pilot, you also have to write fast. So part of the writing process is also helping you to have some confines so that you can write faster, right? For me at this point, the amount of writing that I do is dependent on the amount of projects that I have. And currently there are a number of projects. So that's why I have to do a lot of writing. I would like to get to the point where I write 3 pages a day. I could write 3 pages a day for the rest of my life and I'm still cranking out work at a high level. That would make me happy. Mm-hmm. But right now it's several pages a day or several scenes. Once I get to a certain point, I can't even count pages anymore. I have to count scenes because I'm like, yeah, you got 10 pages, but you only did 2 scenes, because you overwrite. So now I have to just count scenes. You got 30 scenes left, bitch. So yeah.
You mentioned a feature taking 3 months. And you have a a lot of deadlines that are imposed on you right now because you have a lot of projects in play. But does it help you to create your own deadlines, maybe in seasons where you don't have all these many projects in play, or, when you're more creating for yourself?
Yes. And in those cases, I use my story editor as accountability, or my team, where I'm like, I need to finish this. Let's get on a schedule. Or I'll tell my team, I'll have this to you by X date, and I don't want to let them down. So that has helped. Deadlines are our friends. I just think intense deadlines are miserable. They are miserable, especially when you are, you're working or you're staffed. So when you're staffed, you have these intense deadlines. It's miserable. Ever wonder how a novel went from the page to the screen? How an entire film derived from a great magazine article? Or how you get the life rights to tell the story of that fascinating person you met or historical figure you're obsessed with? Learn the process in our new on-demand course called Based On: How to Adapt Books, Articles, and Real-Life Stories for Film and TV. Led by myself, Felicia Pride, and Dria Rowland, Honeychild's creative executive and co-host of the Creative Cut Up podcast, you'll learn the process of optioning and developing IP for adaptation, the nuances of 3 different types of adaptations: books, articles, life rights, all the development jargon, what Honeychild looks for and how we source, search, and track IP, plus the answers to all of your burning questions. We'll break down the ins and outs of adapting IP and more. You'll get immediate access to our on-demand course for 6 months upon registration. So sign up today at thecreatedaily.com.
I want to get back to the 100 comments from your story editor. So when do you determine something is studio ready? When the comments from the story editor are minimal or none? What does that studio ready version look like?
Usually after the page note session, I feel like it's going to be ready. I don't really like to turn in something like right now. Time is kind of an essence. And I'm like, do I have enough time for page notes? Like, no, I got to make time for page notes. Like, I think that is when because they're so exhaustive that I feel like, and for the most part, I know when it's studio ready. There have been times where I'm like, oh, this is good. And my story editor's like, is it? That can be a little like, shit, I thought I was closer than what I was, until like, she starts pointing out things that I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't even see that. Cause there's so much that you're holding your head, particularly for features. There's so much that you have to hold in your head when you're writing them, because you have to tell this complete story that I find very challenging. So that's why the process is important. But yeah, like that's when I usually know that it's studio ready, once I've gone through the page notes and I've addressed the exhaustiveness of it. Because by that point, we've done so much high level work and I'm very clear on what the story is. By that point, this is like, yes, it might be 100 comments, but it's like, it's refining. It's going deeper, but the overall structure and everything is working. So I'm curious, Georgette, you have taken some TV writing classes. What was your experience around writing process? What did you learn about the writing process through that experience?
And so I did, let's call it TV 101, 102. So the TV 101 class, you have an idea that you want to create into a pilot. You don't have to be a writer. It's for anybody that just has an idea that they want to workshop and create. And so that was the class where I understood what beat sheets were and the process of actually going through steps to create your story. And so that was helpful to understand. The way they teach it, it's basically self-paced. And so you're watching these videos on your own, and then you're checking in with an advisor a couple of points during the class. And then you're turning in your 2 big homework assignments, which was by the end of the first class, 101, you had your beat sheet to turn in. So I was like, okay, cool. By the time I got to class 102, I was like, well, this whole story is going to change, right? Because of the feedback they gave me, I wanted to change the story. It just felt like it needed to go in a different direction. And 102, we actually had hands-on advisors that we were working with. And so by the time we were leaving that class, we were going to have at least a draft of a pilot. And so the advisor that I was assigned to, everyone has their thing. She was about story. And so every piece of feedback she gave us was about story. She loved how I knew how to format. I nailed formatting. I got it down. But formatting is not the story, right? Like you have to be able to nail what you're trying to say. So when she would give feedback, I needed like a day or two because I was so scared to go in there and look at her notes. I was like, I'm not even like a real writer. I don't know what to do with these notes when you give them to me. Like, I'm just gonna have to figure this shit out as I go along. And so most of the time her notes weren't horrible. She was just asking questions to help me understand what I'm trying to get across and making sure that what I'm writing actually makes sense. Because to your point, when you were talking about in another episode, Felicia, you have to write to the screen. So when you're writing in this script, are we able to see this on the screen? One, are you giving up too much information in the description versus the dialogue happening with the characters? So it was also trying to weave this information of understanding the process of writing for television. So after that, I was like, okay, cool. We got a pilot, which I still haven't gone back to fix. I was like, I'm jumping to a screenwriting class next. I'm going to learn how to write a feature film. Failed miserably. I barely left that class with an outline because that was what you were leaving the screenwriting class with. And I really saw the difference between writing a feature and a pilot. And it was hard. It was really hard to connect, all these acts together, making sure the story made sense. And so I was like, I should have taken a break after 102 and this TV writing class, but it helped me understand at least the writing process. And I want to go back and take some more writing classes just to tighten up my writing. But it was those classes, they were great. You scratched the surface of learning how to write, but now you got to get back in there to really actually apply the things that you learned. And so that's what it was for me.
When you see the process, you like, oh, I got to really want to write because I got to write and then write some more and then write some more. So that I think is really, really tremendous. And also, the writing process will reveal certain things of like your story's not working. So one studio feature that I was working on not too long ago, it took me forever to find that film. Mind you, the pitch was great. Pitch was great. Everybody loved the pitch. But then when I got into the screenwriting of it all, I was like, shit, what is this movie? I got to find this film. What is this film? Another project that I worked on, another feature film, I couldn't find myself in it anymore. I was like, what is my connection to it? Because I do not want to fucking write this. Like, what is my connection? What's my way in? What's my way in? What's my way in? So those are things that are revealed during the writing process, right? That you got to push through, especially if you have a deadline and some people have cut you a check, right? When you don't have a deadline, don't cut your check. It really you are forced to look at, is this something that I really want to do? Is this a story that I really want to tell? Am I the right person to tell this story? Like all those questions can reveal themselves through the writing process.
Absolutely. I realized though, between the two classes, I would love to explore more of the TV writing side first to really kind of even hone, because I feel like that was the side that you could really hone your voice, right? Because everything was falling apart. Like the story was falling apart. Things were all over the place. It turned left in one scene and it was just like, girl, I feel like I'm in another TV show. And I was like, my bad, Daphne. Shout out to Daphne. But for me to be a better producer, that was also the reason why I started taking these TV writing classes, because it was important for me to understand the artist's process.
I think feature writing is the hardest writing I've ever had to do. And I've written in a lot of forms. I think feature writing is the hardest. But I think it's because you have to tell a complete story in a set page count. And I don't know any other form where you have to do that. Even poems, I always say, could be a book. There's book length poems. So that is really, really challenging. Scope is really hard for features, like the scope of what you have to cover. And the real estate is so precious in features that you really have to make very strategic story choices. And also has to, act 2 is where everything goes to die. So you have to be able to like craft act 2 that moves and has movement and energy. And it's really, really challenging. And so that's why there's much upfront work that can be done in the outlining stage. And then as much work can be done in the rewriting stage for me, has worked, has helped.
Have you ever gotten notes and just said, you know what, maybe this isn't a story, I should scrap it? Or have you always found a way to salvage it and turn it around?
I learned about protecting my process when I turned in a draft to producers that was not ready. And they freaked the fuck out. I knew I had to do a page 1 rewrite on it, but I was like, let me send this in to see, like, gauge. I don't know why I sent it in. To be honest, that was not smart. But they freaked the fuck out. And so then you're losing sort of trust, and they're anxiety ridden, right? So it's like, oh my God, you choose the right writer. And oh my God, this what? And also a lot of times folks don't understand the creative process, and the creative process is messy. And if you do not understand how messy the creative process is, a lot of folks are shielded from how messy the creative process is. If I were to show you my first draft, you'd be like, bitch, what? You say you're a writer? Are you kidding? And that's why you have to be very, very careful about who you bring into your creative process. And so now that I found my very close circle, that's the only people I bring into my creative process, because people may not understand that I know I'm going to be able to turn it around, right? If my story editor is like, it's not ready, I'm like, fuck. I know I'm going to figure it out. And I trust in the writing process, and I trust in my talent. A lot of times execs don't know you like that. They don't know your track record of delivering at the highest level. They don't know that. So I try not to submit things that are not ready. But I have pulled out a project that I was like, I can't pull this off. And I remember even one project I was close to I even told my team, I said, guys, this is my last hoorah. This was the draft that I had turned in, the project I had turned in, a draft that wasn't ready. But then I talked to the producers. I was like, I think the premise is not working. And that's why I'm struggling. I think the premise is not working. He was like, what do you think? So I repitched a premise. I was like, let me try this. It was a complete page one rewrite. And I was like, and it was so difficult to get through. But I told my team, I said, hey guys, I'm going to do my best, but I may get fired. I just want you to know that. But at least, I'm going to do this last attempt at this with this new premise. And I'm going to put all my process and work into it. But it may not be it. Luckily, it came together beautifully. But that was a project I was going to pull out of. And then there was another project I pulled out of as well, where I was just like, this really isn't for me. I have a good take. And when I think about having to write it after having that experience of writing something so difficult, now I'm very clear on, if I do not feel 150% about it, I have to say no, because bitch, you're going to have to write it. And that is miserable. It's miserable trying to write something that you don't connect with, even with your process, or it's not your bag. I want to write stuff that I know is my bag. And that doesn't mean that I'm not stretching myself, right? But it's like, there's got to be something here that I can really hold on to significantly and substantially, so that I don't have to pull out, or I don't have notes where I feel like I can't turn this around. So I'm curious, Dria, what aspects of the writing process have you seen from a development executive standpoint? What has been your process of working with writers during the writing process?
And even though I primarily work in unscripted development in my day job, a lot of that is giving notes. And like we said in a previous episode, a lot of people don't think that comedy has to have like the same structure as just a basic narrative structure, your beginning, your middle, your end, your conflict, your climax. And so in unscripted, I have to apply some of those same principles that you would apply to a scripted show or a drama show, and make sure that that comedy show, unscripted show, has all those elements and hits all the beats. Another thing is that for an unscripted show, I'll give several rounds of notes. So I might actually look at the script and the development process. I'm going to we probably do like 2 to 3 drafts with the writer before we go ahead and shoot it. And then I'm going to do notes on the rehearsal. I'm going to do notes on the first episode. I'm going to do notes before and after the first episode, and how could we, change it for episode 2. So there's so many rounds of notes actually that I didn't know that it was going to be so many rounds. And so my number one goal is to make sure that I have empathy for the writer, right? Like what you're saying, really respecting how much goes into it, really respecting the story you want to tell. And even though my job is to get it network ready, I still really want to be careful and respect your voice and your perspective as well. And then making sure I'm servicing the story. Like, I think sometimes part of my job is making sure like you're communicating what you think you're communicating as a writer. So you might know what you're trying to say, but when I read it on the page, like, is there a disconnect? Like, am I following you? I think, a lot of my role is to fill in those gaps if there are gaps.
Because there are definitely times where I'm like, oh, I'm in my head. Like, I think that it's on the page. It ain't on the page.
Yeah.
It's in my head.
I look at it like that.
Yeah, it's in my head.
And I think coming from a journalism background really, really helps me with giving notes, because my number one thing with journalism is making sure you cover the who, what, when, where, why, how, right? So then when I read the script, I'm like, did we cover the basics? And also, the most important thing is why? Why are we telling this story? So I make sure that the notes answer that question. Like, did we justify why this story is being told? Like, I told the audience why they should care? I think that's kind of my role too when I give notes. But I don't envy writers because, when it gets to the studio side, you got about 3 or 4 executives maybe. And sometimes we tell you stuff that we not on the same page. So It's like, y'all not on one accord. How do I know how to find a note behind a note? So that is something to it. Because I am junior, I do sometimes I defer to more senior colleagues and they've been doing this longer. They know what the network wants. They know the mandates, whatever. So I kind of see what they're saying, follow their lead. But there are things that sometimes I feel passionate about and we disagree, and I verbalize that as well. And I just try to make sure that we're on the same page before we go to that writer, because we don't want to slow down the process by giving confusing notes. You know what I mean?
Well,
yeah.
That's
I'm
great.
sure I know it happens.
Don't care. They don't care, honey. The studio thinks one way, the network thinks another, the production company thinks another. So yes, but that's really great to hear about your perspective on, I think, also servicing the story and then just helping the writer to make sure that they're communicating what they want to communicate. I think that's huge. And I think that's why getting that feedback from folks early on is helpful. Because I know some writers that just develop with producers, like they don't send it to nobody but the producers. And I think that's very bold, because I'm like, I want to make sure that people that know, also when you have a shorthand with your writers group and you have a shorthand with whoever you get notes from, they understand your writing. They also understand your quirks. Like, you have a tendency to do this, so they can find those things. So yeah, but I think that's great about helping writers to understand what they're trying to communicate, for sure.
One time I was taking TV writing classes too, Georgette, and they have been immensely helpful. But I think we got the opposite issue. Myself as a writer, I can nail voice, but the structure be like, tighten this up. But don't let that disturb you.
But you can learn structure. You can learn structure.
Yes.
You can learn structure.
But I would say in one of my classes, there was this guy in the class, right? And the end goal, like you said, Georgette, for 102 was to do a pilot. Everybody turned in a pilot except for this one guy, right? And so the teacher is like berating him. Why would you waste your time and come to this class and not do the homework? Y'all, I read the next week in Deadline, his books had got picked up by HBO. Like, I'm like, this man is just fine. He was just here to make sure he know what to do when he go in the room so he can communicate with writers. And I thought that was so...
He's like, because I've been busy. That's right.
Right.
That's funny.
The one thing I also kind of want to stress is, I think the one thing you learn about, Warren, in TV writers' rooms and that writing process, which we talked a little bit about in episode 4 inside the writer's room, is that you're not a bad writer because you get a lot of notes.
I think that's big.
And I think that because you can kind of internalize that, because there's many reasons, right? Some of the notes are just going to be bad notes like this, so we can just throw those out. Some of the notes is just, again, not necessarily communicating what you want to communicate, what you intended to communicate, because you are holding so much story in your head and you're getting so much story out. In TV in particular, it's sometimes not knowing where the story is going, but the writers know where the story is going, but the execs may not know. So being able to have a conversation about that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a bad writer. Now, there are bad writers, right, that exist. How do you know the difference per se? I think that it's also like the nature of the notes. Like, some notes are really about going deeper, right? They're about going deeper, wanting more specificity. I think that's one thing too, that as we get into page notes with my story editor, they're usually about being more specific. Like, let's go more specific in this monologue you have here. Let's be more specific. We got the structure down. Now let's get deeper. But when you have like huge structural notes, I think that's when you know, like, okay, there's more work that I need to do here around my craft. That's a flag. But getting notes is part of the writing process when you're working with the industry, and also getting feedback from your writers groups. And that's all part of it. I think the other thing is, can you pull it off? I think that makes the difference between good writers and not so ready writers is, through the rewriting process, can you pull off the draft? If you can't pull it off, that's something to then look at and be concerned about. But if you're in the writing process, you're like, okay, I got a round of notes, and you turn it around and you make something even better out of it. That's a green flag that like, yeah, I got something here. I know how to go through the process and know how to revise in a way that makes this better.
I will say to that point, sometimes writers don't want to make it work. I have seen multiple rounds of notes where me and my colleagues are like this, and this, and they send us another draft where they did not touch none of that. And it's like, okay, they standing on business. All right, well then.
And I think that's warrants a conversation that is like, this is, one of my approaches is like, I tried it this way, and this is what happened when I did. Or I'll let you actually see how I tried it. You can see it don't work for yourself. But I think sometimes that the conversation isn't had of why did I found that sometimes that's why I always like to have a conversation about notes in addition to getting written notes. Because one, I like to hear the tone from the exec. Yeah. Because that tells me priority. And I also like to ask questions about like where the note's coming from. So I understand kind of the context around it. And then 3 gives me an opportunity to explain why I did something. And sometimes when you explain it, the execs are like, oh, I get it now. You know what I mean? But that explanation isn't necessarily on the page, but it's like, oh, this is what I was trying to do. And they're like, oh, if that's what you're trying to do, then maybe you just need to go deeper or like, go in more. But I think the conversation is really, really important versus just having the written notes and having no conversation about it.
I would agree.
Well, that is our dip into the writing process because there's definitely so much to talk about, but definitely just wanted to get across the amount of work that writers do during this process. Also for respect the process, but also for writers, developing their process, protecting their process, and trusting in their process are things that are really, really important.
We should call this episode that. Trust the process.
Trust the process, honey. You got to. This takes us to our How We Create segment where we share all forms of inspiration that may have stopped us in our tracks, made us laugh, had us shouting, or even reminded us to rest.
In the spirit of writing process, I would say a show that I've been watching, it's called Not Dead Yet. It's a quirky comedy. And most specifically, I feel seen by so Gina Rodriguez plays the main character, Nell, who's this obituary writer. And she has a roommate, and his name is Edward, played by Rick Glassman. And I feel so seen, but it was so funny because there was something specifically that he said, and it makes me think about the advisor that I have in the TV Writing 102 class. And she was like, always find ways to show who the character is without necessarily them having to say it. And if they do say who they are, it's in a way where it's not so prescriptive. And so there was something that he said that really defined who he was. And I already knew who he was personality wise. And I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so seen by this character. So Not Dead Yet, and the character Edward in that show is my thing.
It's always cool to see yourself, on screen, no matter who the character is.
Absolutely.
For me, don't cry for me, y'all. For me, I am inspired by heartbreak this week because I have found it to be disruptive and something that you can't rush. The process is the process. But because I got shit to do, I can't stay here long. So I have been looking at it as what can I learn from this process so that I can move on to the next phase? I'm all about trying to move forward. And, an ending is an opportunity for a new beginning. And you know how we do. We start to do everything new in every area of our life. So, yes. Using that momentum to level up.
Well, I will say too, since, you're helping to shape stories, I think that feeling the heartbreak so that when you see it on the page, it'll ring true to you. Or if you write it on the page, it'll ring true to you. Like, I know what this feels like and this ain't it on this page. You know what I mean? But like, or the nuances of it, the shades of it, being able to, as much as move on. Absolutely. But also, feel the feels, feel the feelings so that you can channel that into powerful work.
Second that. Mm-hmm.
We kind of get our romance shit on at Honey Child, and everything ain't going to have a happy ending because that's not how we do it. So like we got to feel all these relationship stages for sure.
You're right about that.
I've been very inspired by Quinta Brunson. We talked about the writing process and knowing the writing process, but also the process of working with production companies and studios and networks, and getting a show on the air is very, very difficult. I think we talk about it. I feel like the odds are like better to get hit by lightning, but she has crafted a show that just feels so good, and that has such a specific voice, and the characters have such specific voices. And I'm just very inspired also by her, of course, her journey, but I also am just awed by, I know most of what it took. I don't know all of it, because I'm sure it took even more than I could imagine, but I know most of what it took to get that show on the air, and for it to be winning awards and touching people. And it's a show I can laugh with my mama watch and laugh with my mama is very, very inspiring. And then I've had friends who have, been able to be a part of the show and just talk about how much of a wonderful environment that Quinta runs. So just inspired by that, of like the keep going aspect of it, if it serves you, the keep going aspect of it. But yeah, just super, super inspired by Quinta.
Yeah. Felicia, I don't know if you remember, I went to one of your beach days, and one of the actresses on Abbott came by the beach day. So even before Abbott came out, she was just saying like, this is the best experience I've had on set. I really feel good about this. I feel like we have something special. And she really enjoyed going to work. And you can see that on the screen. You can feel the love when you watch it. And so it was cool to see her say, I feel like this is special. And then these months later, these seasons later, to see it and be like, no, it really is. So I'm inspired by that one too.
Absolutely. It really is special. Yes.
And God bless the network that said no the first time, because I think she talked about that in an interview, like whoever she pitched it to first, they said no.
Honey, somebody got fired.
Okay. Okay.
And that's the best revenge.
But yeah, so thank y'all for joining us for another episode of the Creative Cut Up podcast. Thank you. We are so grateful for each and every one of you. And please join us here again next week. Thanks for listening to the Creative Cut Up podcast, a lively and honest space for storytellers that sits at the intersection of craft, business, and independence. Listen to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you dig it, subscribe, rate, review, and please tell a friend. If you need help getting back into your creative practice, check out the Creative Comeback Workbook and Journal. You can also join our newsletter and our We Create Daily community, both of which provide even more resources and opportunities to thrive creatively at thecreatedaily.com. And lastly, follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn at The Create Daily. Acting on your ideas is a form of self-love. And when I decided to write the Creative Comeback Workbook and Journal, it was with you in mind. Storytellers with stories inside of you that you need to get out into the world. But life, fear, uncertainty has a way of leaving us stuck. But no more. It's time to reclaim our creative practice and get unstuck. The Creative Comeback Workbook and Journal can help you get back on creative track. 30 days of dynamic prompts, exercises to stimulate creativity, alongside motivational quotes, journal pages, and more. If you're ready to create again, get your copy of the Creative Comeback Workbook and Journal today at creativecomeback.com. That's creativecomeback.com. Because it's never too late to become the artist you always wanted to be.